We're on. Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to 67 Pall Mall, and it gives me great pleasure to see the smiling face of someone I've known for quite a while, but don't see often enough, and that's Jim Clendenen, the wild man of Californian winemaking, who's joining us this evening live from sunny California, and we're very jealous that you're getting as much sunshine as you are. Jim, and all of you,
it's gorgeous here.
A glass of wine
Thank
with
you, Dimitri. Thanks for having me. Cheers to you, and cheers to anyone else who's listening in with us.
First question, why are you called the Wild Man? What is that from?
Well, it's funny because it's from Jancis Robinson, who's been a strong supporter of us, and I really appreciate everything she does to spread the good word about what style of wine we make at Bon Climat, and the fact that we've kind of kept our eyes on the goal all along and haven't changed back and forth with styles. The first time that she interviewed Bob Lindquist of Cupay at that time, now of Lindquist Family Vineyards, and myself, she wrote an article in the Financial Times about the wild boy of California wines, which de facto made Bob the mild boy of California wines. And as soon as Jasper Morris read that, he said, "Jim, we have to make a wine and call it the Wild Boy." This is probably 22, 23 years ago. And I thought we'd make the Wild Boy wine for about one vintage, maybe no more. If one note samba, get done with it as fast as you can. And I've tried to stop the project a half a dozen times, and everybody complains they love it, the ultimate picnic wine. And I'm kind of looking at it and going, well, I'm certainly not the Wild Boy of California wine anymore, and I want to go to the Wild Grandpa, but I know that I would have a legal suit filed against me for doing that.
Before we started, we were looking at the holding screen. We had your hairdos over the decades, and
I love seeing that progression there. Those three, they're pretty funny. One of them is the first year that I started my company back in '82, and my hair, for whatever reason, it must have been wintertime because my hair was kind of dark brown, where usually it was pretty blondish. And then you get to the one where I'm in my rough-hewn country music legend moment.
You look like it. Yeah.
and that is kind of the way I remember my hair. And now it's definitely the at least I've still got hair is the only good thing you can say about it.
Well, oh dear.
And
we can't get haircuts over here, not for another month anyway. So I turned the overhead lighting off so it wouldn't reflect off my forehead. Jim, tell us about your labels, because you produce an awful lot of labels that we don't see in this country. Why do you produce so many labels?
I love winemaking, and if I have the opportunity to purchase or plant grapes that I've always wanted to work with, then I can't say no. I will tell you that about 15 years ago, I was making almost twice as much wine as I'm making now, and I keep trying to prune it down and prune it down and prune it down, and then something will happen with Chardonnay or Pinot Noir, and I'll take on a really new, exciting vineyard that I could work with. I have my own vines that I planted. I've got almost 80 acres in the ground on land that I own, and I have another 100 acres on land that I lease. And when I've done that, I've planted things like Nebbiolo, and I've planted Petit Verdot and different funny little stuff. Right now, I'm obsessed with Grenache Gris and Chenin Blanc. And I know the world will never care, but when I go home and I'm sipping a glass by myself, it'll be one of those two in my hot tub, and it'll be fun to have. But I love it. I'm passionate about wine. And I also am a little bit Burgundian, even though I'd like to think I'm a lot Burgundian. And I don't like to blend things that aren't very consistent. If you pour two wines that taste the same into a bottle and sell it, there's nothing wrong with that. But if you have something like our Sanford and Benedict versus our Knox, or something that is Biennacido versus Kick-On, they're very, very, very different.
Yeah.
Berry Brothers' own wine is made from Kick-On completely, and it's a vineyard that I love. And I've just made my first Kick-On for Bon Climat, but I just could not do it anymore. I kept waiting and waiting and making Kick-On into other really neat projects. And I finally said, we'll take the best grapes we get from Kick-On and make a Kick-On vineyard Pinot. And it's one of our less expensive Pinots, and it's absolutely delicious.
It is delicious, very rich and ripe. It's really lovely. Tell us what hasn't worked for you.
Oh, if I want to put egg on my face, making 14 different Italian varietals at the same time under a company label I had back in the day called Il Podere del Olivos, with my first wife as my partner, and I made really good wines, and I had great reception. My Fiano, my biggest market was in Germany. My some of my bright white wines, my biggest market was in France, because nobody in America cared about Italian varieties, least of all from a non-Italian. And so it was just a huge nightmare. One morning I woke up and I recognized the fact that you could love me. You could love my wines. You could honor me in every sense by being my client. And you still wouldn't buy 10 different white Italians from grapes that ranged from Sicily to the top of the Piedmonte. It was insane. But that shows to go. That's where I've recovered a lot of my facings that I had with my labels. By getting rid of 12 of those Italians, that cut me down to Nebbiolo and Tokai Friulano, which is all I make with Italian grapes now.
And what hasn't worked climatically? Which grapes or blends have just not sung?
We've done pretty well. Santa Barbara's climate is incredibly elastic. It's a very, very, very long, cool, slow ripening area, even though we're in Southern California. This last year, we had the worst week as far as heat that we've ever had in Santa Barbara in 2020. And it got up to 106. It's like Death Valley. It's like the hottest, worst possible place you could be growing in Australia or in South America, when the heat just came on full blast. And we made wonderful 2020s. That week of heat didn't do anything, because the following week it was back down to 75 Fahrenheit instead of at 106, and things calmed down, and it set the vines a little bit backwards in continually evolving in maturity. We had some things that ended up really ripening slowly after that, because the vines just had the oomph taken out of them. But it's a general, we're a cool enough climate that we can experiment with very cool climate varieties. We've done remarkably well with Nebbiolo, which is kind of a shock to me and every place else. I could actually ripen Barbera, which there was a real thought that we couldn't, because it wasn't hot enough to ripen Barbera, and that worked. And so I think the benign climate in Santa Barbara gives us a little bit more flexibility. I remember when there was this huge hue and cry that people were planting up near Tocolon in Napa. They were planting Sauvignon Blanc, Chenin Blanc, and Riesling. And of course, the Riesling didn't taste like any Riesling anybody had from the Rheingau, that's for sure. And when you've got some of the world's best ground for Cabernet Sauvignon, wine lord's name, would you plant wines that you can barely sell for $7 a bottle back then? It was pretty crazy.
But when you arrived in Santa Barbara back in the 80s, what was going on viticulturally?
Everything was really uninteresting clones that were planted. They were all planted direct rooted, so nothing had any rootstock, which we thought was good in the beginning. But after I was in the business for 20 years, I realized it wasn't good on any level, that there were devigorating rootstocks that could come into play and make the vines much more balanced instead of vigorously growing. Huge amounts of space between the vines, because the tractors were huge. We had no small tractors, and nobody had any motivation to get small tractors. And so in my cynical way, and Dimitri, I'm a little bit of a cynic. I'm a little bit of a whinger and a carper on the sidelines. And I like to look when somebody says, I've got very old vines. I have the oldest vines in the county. And I go, well, I feel sorry for you, because that meant the person who planted them didn't have a clue what they were doing. In the way that we've replanted all the vines we've worked with, though I still have 2 sites that, because of the greatness of the sites, where the vines are approaching 50 years old now. They were the original vine years, 72, 73, right around that period of time, 71, that Santa Barbara was planted. And Bienacido, I've got very old vines. And Sanford and Benedict, I have very old vines. And I have to tell you that as I've watched my own vineyards, it was one of the things you wanted to talk about later, and I'll just sum it up now. As I've watched my vineyards move from just planted to 10 years old, 15 years old, 20 years old, and I've got my own vines, my oldest vines that I have are now 26, 20, 27 years old. The quality of the grapes are so much better. And, we'd always heard that from France, but we were coming from really ground zero. We weren't taking a vineyard that was established and taking out one old plant and sticking in one in its place and waiting for 20 years until that was good. We were just scraping the whole thing out or grafting and doubling and tripling the density. We were planting things with much more interesting clonal material, as it turned out. And those vineyards, as they've gotten between 20 and 30 years of age now, have really rescued my career, because there was a period of time when we were first recognized. And, that was in the latter part of the 80s. My wines were first imported into the UK after the 85 harvest. My wines were all over the United States, and we started getting a lot of attention. We got some great notoriety. I had one very famous critic say I was one of the top 10 most interesting wineries in the world when our winery was 7 years old. And I got to tell you, that wasn't true on any level.
But
we were babies.
But it helped you.
Oh, it made me, no question about it. It made me.
Who was that person, if you don't mind me asking?
Robert Parker.
It was Robert Parker, okay.
Yeah. And then a little bit later, he wasn't so convinced about our work and the style we worked with and what we did. But in the beginning, he was absolutely seminal in getting Bon Climat known. And so my partner at the time, Adam Tomac, and I benefited so much from that. There was a huge international tasting in Switzerland put on by a wine magazine. And they had 400 or 410 different references. And I got number 7 out of 400. It was the 1986 vintage. And the 86 vintage was a great vintage for us. Dominique Lafon got number 6. And I've always said the only reason that Dominique and I are still good friends is because I didn't beat him in that tasting, or I know that A, I would have had to pay for all my glasses of Merceau when I was in Burgundy visiting him, and B, he would have not believed it was the truth on any level. But it was great. And it was those things that were happening in our first decade of work that got a lot of attention. And that amount of attention is something we've been able to consolidate. And there's some people that you look and they're really famous in the beginning for what they did. And by 20 years into what they're doing, they'd forgotten what they were doing, go from, 12.5 alcohol to 15.5 alcohol and act like there's no change, because, that famous cellar bias that people get.
Well, we're going to talk about that, because you were saying, and I've noticed, having sold your wines for almost 20 years, that they've reduced in alcohol. And some of them have stayed more or less the same. But stylistically, if anything, they've become, through your own knowledge and through better understanding of the land and through older vines, they've become finer and finer. When you set out with Chardonnay, Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, and Pinot Noir, did you have Burgundy in mind? Because Burgundy is your great love, and you have lots of friends there.
I did. I started my company. It was an interesting progression. The first place that I visited, wine country at all, was in France. I turned 21 living in Bordeaux, of all places. And I went back after I graduated from university, and I spent most of my time in Burgundy, but also time in Champagne. And then I decided that I wanted to focus my career on becoming a winemaker. I wasn't sure, but I wanted to kind of check it out. And so I started working in the late 70s at Zaca Mesa Winery, and I learned the American way to make wine, which is basically using equipment, having an indifferent relationship with your vineyards. You're not trying to perfect them, but not trying to ignore them either, and do a lot of processing and let the cellar be an important part of what you're doing, but not the most important part, and let the lab be the most important part. So if you need to add acid, if you need to change anything, you could do that. And it really had nothing to do with the grapes when you're getting involved like that. I went from Zaca Mesa after 3 harvests working there down to Australia. And I worked there, and they are not a technical country as far as winemaking, but they're incredible. Were then. This is a long time ago, 1981. And they were incredible in the equipment that they could build out of nothing, bits and pieces of stuff hanging around. They had nobody to help them. There was no indigenous Latino labor force like we have. And so I learned a lot about what you could do with very little when I was down there. And I learned a lot about responsibility, because you took responsibility for what you did. There was no other way to pass it on to anybody else. And then I went to Burgundy and I worked, Becky Wasserman was my muse and mentor, and helped me and opened more doors than any human being could possibly. Also, where I met Jasper Morris at that time. And so in '81, I worked a 3-day stage training program with Claude Laboustor, with Gerard Potel. And Gerard was a very, very, very advanced scientific winemaker. He was experimenting with things that nobody else in Burgundy were using, because he wasn't Burgundian. He was from down around the French and Spanish border. You know, he went to Montpellier. He didn't go to Dijon, and he had his own ideas. And then I went from there to the Domaine Duc de Magenta with Philippe McMail and a really great team of guys. And they gave me a lot of responsibility, and I took it on. And when I left there, I realized that instead of having to own a chateau, have a title, Duke, Count, Baron, like you would in Bordeaux, that in Burgundy, if you had room in your basement for 30 barrels, if you had a tractor and you owned a few rows of vines, you could be the most important man in your appellation if you worked hard enough doing it. And so when Adam and I started Bon Climat back then, we picked our own grapes for 3 years. We couldn't afford to hire pickers to pick. We would get up in the morning at 6 in the morning and go and pick a ton of Chardonnay, put it in the press it, clean it up, barrel it down, and we'd have 3 barrels fermenting for the next day or getting ready to ferment. And we'd go home at 8 o'clock, eat a small dinner, go to sleep, get up at 6, and so keep on going.
Tell us about Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc. When did they appear on the scene for you? This is the 2018. Is it,
I started making Pinot Blanc in 1989, and I had some Pinot Blanc in '88, but I blended it with Chardonnay, and the wine was 11.8 alcohol, if it was that, crisp as you could imagine, totally delicious. And there are very few bottles to find now of my '89 and '90, '91, but if you can find them, they're extraordinary. I did a vertical tasting of every Pinot Blanc that I'd made about 3 years ago for a guy who called me up and said he was a huge Pinot Blanc supporter. And I said, I love you, come over, we'll drink them all, because nobody else cares about it. And we tasted them all. It was remarkable how well they'd aged. And it made me laugh, because here's a wine that goes through malolactic fermentation, fermented in barrel, bottled without filtering, and it's just crisp and lovely at the end of 20 years in the bottle. And why people thought you had to wait and pick those things at 14% alcohol, pick them when they're flat as a board, don't put them through malolactic. The whole thing was a bit crazy. Then I planted, I was infatuated with the idea of Pinot Bourreau, because I was tasting some wines from Burgundy that were made, that were absolutely wonderful. And they were pure Pinot Bourreau. They were clones of Pinot Gris that were tiny and very, very, very dark. And Becky had a couple of people that worked with them north of the city of Beaune, south of Dijon. And I love those wines. And so I planted some. Then I found out that all I could really call the wine on the label was Pinot Gris. Then you get into that Pinot Gris thing. Is it sweet? Does it have a huge amount of botrytis? Is it flat and heavy? Is it elegant? And so I didn't know what to do. I was waiting in Dijon for a train. I bought a magazine because the trains always run late in France. Had time to read the whole magazine, and the magazine article was about Corton Charlemagne. I found out that the Corton Charlemagne had been for 1,000 years Pinot Bourreau, Pinot Blanc, and Aligoté. So in 1998, I started making that wine, and we're going to taste one of those a little bit later today. It's become actually our most popular white wine style now. The fastest selling, not expensive, but it's among the more expensive whites we make. And this wine right here.
Sites is this from? Is it from Biennacido, isn't it?
This is from the, yes.
Is it from one site?
Aligoté comes from Le Bon Climat, my vineyard, but the Pinot Blanc are old vines of Pinot Blanc that Biennacido had for a long time, and I planted the Pinot Gris. at Biennacido.
But is it all in one contiguous site, or is it from different sites adjacent to each other?
The Gris and the Block are really close to each other, and then the Aligoté is across the road.
And when you tried at first selling this in the US, what did people say?
Everybody liked it. I don't know what to say about it because I love it. And I drink a lot of it. It's very complex. I had the editors of Revue de Vin de France, and one of them was Michel, I can't remember his last name now, it's embarrassing, but a great guy. And we had lunch, drank a bunch of wine. I showed him all these really showy Chardonnays that I thought he would compare glamorously to at least Premier Cru white Burgundies. And at the end, he and the gentleman that he was with, who I didn't know, but turned out to be the largest volume writer for Revue de Vin de France, asked me if I knew what my best wine was. And I picked the best reserve Chardonnay. And they said, no, it's the Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc. And that was because I was the only person in any area that they knew about who could make Pinot Gris and Pinot Blanc in a delicious, creamy, barrel fermented, malolactic positive kind of way, and bottle it. When you think about it, where else? If you go to Alsace, they really diminish the greatness of Pinot Blanc. If you go to the Alto Adige, they love Pinot Blanc, but the wine's very crisp and clean and lean, and it's not quite the creamy Burgundian style that I want to make.
Yeah, so this has great balance. The grapes really complement each other, which begs the question: when you look at your friends' prices, the Burgundian prices, what do you make of your own pricing?
It's a complicated thing. I think that there's always been such a limit to the amount of Burgundy available, and it's so rare. Americans were spoiled. Can you imagine that we could call a small grower in, say, Vosne Romanée, and we could buy 50 cases of his Premier Cru and Grand Cru wines, and not even have to buy his Bourgogne or his Pas-tu Grain or his Village wines. And now, of course, you can't do that because they wouldn't sell them to you like that. No. But the prices have gone totally insane. I always bring up Christophe Roumier because I don't scratch the price tag off of any of Christophe's bottles that I have, because the price tag will say like $89.95, and the new price tag, if you bought it from the same wine shop 25 years later, would say $2,000 for the Musigny or for the Chambol, Les Amoureuses and stuff like that. It's just amazing how it's changed, but I don't fault them for doing that at all. But I do have to tell you, as you'd guessed, Dimitri, and I think the UK is the biggest example of this for me, that the ability, if people have good palates and they have comfort and confidence in their palates, and they taste a wine blind and they say, this wine reminds me of a Premier Cru from so-and-so. It's a style that I associate with that. I really love this wine. And you see a price that's $40 for my wine compared to $140 for a Premier Cru white Burgundy, minimum, then our wines sell really well. And the places that this kind of an idea overflows into are like Japan. The Japanese believe in their palate. They love their palate. If they're tasting blind, and if Bon Climat Knox does well in a tasting that has a bunch of much more expensive famous Burgundies in it, instead of being like the American tasters who would then go back to the bags, pull the wine out, figure out why they were wrong in a blind tasting, and then they would say, the Vosne Romanée is opening up really well now, and the Bon Climat is falling apart because their eyes are telling them what to taste instead of their palate. The Japanese are just the opposite. So we've had a huge amount of growth over the last 20 years in Japan, a huge amount of growth in the UK. And you know who we can thank for that? You and a whole bunch of guys that work for BBR and for Fields Morris and Verdon. And I can't go any place in the UK, any restaurant, without seeing my wine, and that makes me really happy.
You can thank Becky Wasserman for having these two acolytes in you and Jasper. Can we talk about
Becky really made me.
can we talk about this extraordinary label, second bottle in, the Wild Boy? Now, whenever I was teaching class or giving a tasting or just having drinks with customers in the past, and I pulled out this bottle, people loved it. The label leads you to believe that the wine is going to be something that it's not. You think it's going to be a big, brash, oaky Californian Chardonnay in the northern mold, and it's not. It's vibrant, but it's very delicate and really quite softly spoken compared to the great majority. How did you?
And it's very much an ABC style. Very much an ABC style. And once again, Chancellor wrote Wild Boy. Jasper saw Wild Boy. He told me to make a wine in the wild side. And we went through 13 different labels, all caricatures of me with long hair. And, if I really liked it, since in America right now, it seems like celebrate Princess Diana. I made one that was the sweetest picture of me drawn by this caricature artist that I'd ever seen. And I showed it to Jasper. I said, "Don't you think that's the best one?" And he goes, "Jim, you look like Princess Di." So that one didn't last very long. And then finally, about 10 years ago, we stopped changing the label, and we've kept doing it. Though I've tried to stop the project many times. I'm not embarrassed by it, but it's nothing that I feel great about having. I only make it for the UK. There's occasional poaching by somebody in Japan or in Korea, where they like the idea. It's very kitschy, very anime, very fun for them. And so they'll buy a little bit of it, but it's a UK project that I do. And when I go in the UK and we take it around and taste it, all my embarrassment goes away because people honestly like the wine. They find the packaging, cute. And if you could have told me 25 years ago that I'd make that wine for 25 years and people would still think that packaging looks cool, I would have said no way.
I think the packaging is tongue in cheek, and I think people take it as such. If you took it seriously, then you'd be sorely disappointed, I think. Tell us about climate change where you are, because as well as your extreme heat you had last year, as well as extreme drought that has been very un-Santa Barbara, you've had bushfires as well, you've had wildfires. How have these impacted on you? I know you're not in a heavily forested area, but how has climate change impacted on you wanting to produce the wines that you do in this more restrained, foot off the pedal kind of style?
In the realistic assessment of the problems that we have, there are two things that are quite evident. And one of the things is the warmer it gets inland where we are, the cooler the air that comes off the Pacific Ocean is that comes. So we have more fog, we have less sun, and so it works really well. In the same way that when LA would heat up, the fog would begin to come over Santa Barbara, and so we'd be in June and July, instead of hot and sunny, we'd be cool and drizzly and kind of foggy. And so it was apparent it wouldn't impact us as much as it impacts all the people that have mountain ranges that keep the ocean air off their vineyards. And when it gets super hot inland, all they do is get the raucous kind of weather, rain, and different things that happen when those two things meet. It was pretty clear that it wasn't going to be disastrous, but we have slowly but surely gotten to a point where the growing season's a little bit shorter. The weather at night, we used to have 30 to 50 degree swings diurnally. It was incredible. And we maintained such great acidity because of that. And then two things started happening. We started having warmer nights, not hugely warmer, but enough warmth to make two things dangerous. One thing, picking when we want to pick with the grapes having still good acidity. And the other thing, that was the really crazy thing that happened, was that all of our varieties, we're kind of structured in a 3-tier system. Pinot Noir and Chardonnay come in early, then Syrah comes in after that, then Cabernet Sauvignon, which I don't make very much of, but I still make it. The Nebbiolo that we have, the Petit Verdot, and the Mondeuse that I make all come in after that. And we started having Pinot Noir pushed back a little bit. And then we had the Syrah coming in earlier. And we got to the point that to use, I mean, if I told a Burgundian that I was making my business model by trying to have, the tanks that I was using for red wine fermentation used 3 times in a growing season, they'd say I'm an idiot because it's really tough. But we found that it was very, very difficult. So we had to buy more tanks and work harder, work longer hours and stuff. But, but it hasn't been a nightmare so far. I kind of, I understand fully why a lot of people don't like me, but I'll tell you, one of the ways I was in an interview like this a couple of years ago, and they were talking about climate change, and I said, yeah, things have really changed. We are getting so warm; it's heating up so much in Santa Barbara County that pretty soon will be as warm as the North Coast, and nobody in the North Coast really appreciated that very much.
Well, the North Coast might actually be taking note of what you're doing, because when I came to see you in 18 on that MW trip, I couldn't believe the whole rash of new style wines, coastal wines that were much lower in alcohol, much more finely grained in the reds, and much more delicate in the whites. So maybe they're sitting up and taking notice.
I don't know if they're taking notice, but I do know that they understand that the public is taking notice, and that if they want to have success in selling their wines consistently, you can't just do something arcane and bizarre and ram it down people's throats and act like it's important. When you're making a 16.5% alcohol Chardonnay, who wants to drink that at lunch, try to go back to work? It's a complicated thing.
What's the alcohol on the Wild Boy?
Oh, somewhere around 13.2, could be 12.8 in a given year, could be no higher than that.
And with wine number 3, the Bien Nacido Chardonnay, how is it different in terms of its siting and the way you make it from the Wild Boy?
The Bien Nacido wine is one of my what we call the Historic Vineyard Collection program. And I've had a lot of people that own vineyards wondering how old their vines are going to have to be until they become Historic Vineyard Collection wines. And I go, it'll never happen. And they go, how can it never happen? I go, because I'm the one that invented the nomenclature. I'm the one that selected the historic vineyards that I worked with, and I'm not going to select you. I've never bought a berry from you. How could I possibly make you a Historic Vineyard Collection wine? But I had 5 at one point, and I'm down to 3.
That'll make you fresh.
And Bien Nacido is the it's become, as it always has been, our signature wine in that series, because the great wines, the ones I made in Los Alamos, and I still make those, and they're very good. But that's where I started a Bon Climat with Adam Tomac. We had a dairy barn in Los Alamos on Los Alamos Vineyards, which is right next door to my ranch where I know you've been,
yes.
Dimitri, the Rancho La Cuna.
Yeah.
And I've planted that. I haven't planted any Chardonnay there, but I planted a lot of really, really fun things at Rancho La Cuna. But the Chardonnays that we made in the style we wanted to make them, which is the crux right there, because I couldn't make great Pinot Noir in 82, 83, 84, 85, 86. I didn't make great Pinot Noir, but I made okay Pinot Noir for what I had. And then in 87, I got fruit from Sanford and Benedict for the first time. And the style of winemaking that Adam and I were using with those grapes made a phenomenal wine. And it wasn't like we learned a new style. It wasn't like we adapted the style. We just did what we did, and the grapes were so good, so stable, so healthy, so well colored, that the wine became phenomenal. And then we started looking for vineyards that were more like that going along. And 2 years later, we found Bien Nacido, and we started working with that. Then when I recreated the Historic Vineyard Collection, because people like to let me make their vineyard famous back in the 80s and 90s, and then kick me off the property when the property sold. And everybody who did it came back to me later on. Los Alamos, our vineyard has never been famous since we kicked you off the property, Jim. And it's like, thanks for noticing. And then I'd get the fruit again and I'd work with them, and it always turned out well. But, I lost Sanford and Benedict in the 90s, and I lost, anyway, I made this idea up. And one of the things that I did that I really wanted to do, and it's a lot of fun for me, I'm at the age now where all of my life is reviewing the things that I've done that have been successful, that have been market door opening, eye opening, that have caught people's attention. And that's one of the great things about wine, is it can catch people's attention blind. So people don't have to come in looking and noticing what's going to go on.
Wine number 3, the Biennacida Chardonnay, is a real attention grabber. How do you make this compared to the Wild Boy? Because it has more extract, it has more new wood.
Exactly. There are those things, but the majority of what it has is it has only great 47-year-old Biennacida fruit in it, and then new oak that's in there, obviously. But it reminds me, and what I tried to do with the historic vineyard idea was go back to 1985, 86, 87, when our wines were first good enough to be have praise heaped on them. And we had them from a lot of people. James Halliday in Australia wrote the California Atlas of fine wine in right about that period of time. And James loved Burgundy, and I loved Burgundy. And he tasted the wine blind, and he said, I don't know who this guy is that makes this wine, but he loves Burgundy, and I love this wine. Then he came out to find me, and we did a lot of things together after that. And at the same time, there was a California writer who wrote an atlas the same way, and you would have thought that Santa Barbara County had never had a vine planted. He didn't care about anything. The only people that were mentioned were the larger, most indifferent to quality wineries that we had in Santa Barbara. And he just didn't even notice what was going on.
Was that ignorance, or was it a direct snub, do you think?
No, it was a man who lived in the North Coast, and he thought the North Coast was where it was at, baby. And he didn't care about driving a full 6 hours to come down and see us. And he never bumped into the wine. And, we weren't in a mass marketing position. The small shops that sold our wine sold a lot of it. They sold a lot of it to very, very acquisitive and inquiring and active customers. And those people tasted the wine and they said, this is what I want. And the massive amount of critics in the beginning didn't pay any attention to it. We now have critics that, like after Rajpar and Jasmine Hirsch's In Pursuit of Balance, we have critics that really appreciate elegance, acidity, tension, nervousness, all the things that you're reading about in, my personal favorite is, because I don't really get it, but the word now that people are using when they're talking about Chardonnay is crunchy. And, it's great, because nobody was talking about crunchy when they had their mouth full of oak-aged mashed potatoes.
I think crunchy is a red wine term, really, rather than a white wine term.
Yeah, I know. Chardonnay with new oak and a lot of tension and concentration, crunchy. And it's just funny, because I never would use that, but I've heard it. So what I did with this, Dimitri, is I went back in the same way that I made my Los Alamos wine, my Sanford and Benedict wine. I went back to the way I made those wines 20 or 25 years ago. And that's what I think is the sexiest thing about the Biennacida, is these grapes at their age now work so well in this style. And it's a lot of fun.
What is the window of maturity for you with Chardonnay? When are the vines generally at their best? It's a bit of a crude question, but you must notice between sort of 15 and 30, they're absolutely singing and giving back so much more than they did in their youth, perhaps.
Absolutely. And, the French were the ones that taught me that at the end of third leaf, virtually the first fruit, you might make a wine that's extraordinary. And then until 10, it goes down in quality, just because the vines get a little bit tired after that first outpouring of great grapes. Yeah. And then after that, they start building back up again. And so, I would say for me, magic numbers are around 15, and around 15 years in the vineyard will give us high quality fruit. And then we have 15 years in the bottle And that shows the wine off really, really well.
Jim, the next wine number 4, is sort of Vina Incognita to me, as I proved earlier. This is the Hildegard. I think I've only had this once. I just didn't see an awful lot of it when I was with FMV BBR. When did this come
There
about?
wasn't a lot that came over.
There wasn't.
And there should have been. And it's like everything. You have a lot of SKUs for me, a lot of facings, and you don't need to have everything. One of your first questions on here, I adored. Why do you make so many different wines? Well, there's a lot of people on the retail and wholesale level that ask that question, and we're not really a business. We've been really lucky with business. I'll tell you that, and there we are. But the Hildegard now it's really, really, really successful, and for a long time, I can't tell you, I was in that classic quandary that you have as a winery owner and passionate winemaker, that I was selling Chardonnays that were 99 and 2000 all the way up to 2004 before anybody was buying my 99 Hildegard. And it's expensive to hold inventory like that. And every time there was an economic downturn, nobody would buy the Hildegard. And now Hildegard sells out faster than any Chardonnay that we make. And
so what's the blend here in the Hildegard?
What's
the blend in the Hildegard?
So it's 50, more or less every year, 55% Pinot Boureau, the Pinot Gris with very, very small clusters, very dark. Pinot Blanc, 40%, and then 5% Aligoté. And I'm taking the Aligoté up a little bit because the Aligoté is like the ultimate balm to wine. It's like Mondeuse with Pinot Noir. If you have to blend an inexpensive Pinot Noir, if you put in Syrah, you're putting in alcohol, color, you're putting in flavor, and people do it, but it doesn't taste right. But if you put in Mondeuse, and if you put in Aligoté, lower alcohol, less new oak, higher acidity, greater length, and all the things that tames, that brings definition to a white wine, and all those things come from Aligoté.
Although perhaps Aligoté shows new wood more than Chardonnay would.
If you put it in new wood, perhaps.
Yeah.
It's just one of the great things about Aligoté is it always has very, very, very low acid.
Yeah.
Very low alcohol, very high acid.
Very high.
And so with low alcohol, the amount of extract that you get from new oak barrels is small.
Yeah, indeed. In fact, as a student, I think you and David Ramey were the ones who told me all about that. And
David's a student, man. David can teach us all about everything.
And he asked me, we're tasting Chardonnays from 12 up to 15.5. He said, which one do you think is in balance? And I said, of this lot, that one. And it was 15%. It just worked the best from what he was making.
And if it does, and then it's great. And we're not going to criticize that.
He's won them by a whole degree since then.
Yeah. And I used to be a Burt Williams of Williams Sellium argument that if you love my wine blind at 15.3 alcohol, then don't tell me I shouldn't make a wine at 15.3 alcohol. Isabel?
Yes.
Are you in the room?
Yes.
Could you come here really quickly?
Indeed.
Okay. I'm going to have you ask one question to my daughter while I use the facility.
This is Jim's daughter, Isabel, after whom the Isabel Morgan cuvee, which is a barrel selection, is named. Hi, Isabel.
Well, it was only Isabel Morgan for 3 vintages, I believe.
Yeah.
Actually, so I could answer that, I guess.
But tell us about Hildegard, though. Hildegard, I guess, is a turn to history, which I didn't even know about. This is telling us that before Corton Charlemagne was planted up with Chardonnay, it was these grapes: Pinot Blanc, Pinot Gris, and Aligoté.
Yes. So there are a couple of stories on the reasoning for that, but Empress Hildegard, one of King Charlemagne's wives, was cited for the reason for planting these 3 grapes in Corton Charlemagne. My favorite story as the reason why is because they would throw a lot of lavish parties and red wine would stain, and she was just tired of her house being covered in stains, and so she was like, white wine, only white wine in our house.
I can imagine it.
And thus planting those grapes.
Could you talk, whilst your pa is away, could you talk about his modus operandi now in the vineyards? Because I remember him being very engaged with an organic approach. And you had a real problem at one time with vine mealybug. But you, at that time,
Yes.
that was 10
So,
years ago, you were organic. Are you still maintaining that approach?
well, he's right here, so he'll answer that question. Perfect timing. Asking about the organic. You used to be organic, and then mealybugs.
Yeah.
What is your status now?
Thank you.
No problem. Nice to talk. Bye.
Jim, are you feeling more relaxed?
Better. It was a very difficult thing for me to confront the imminent death of my vineyard at Le Bon Climat.
I remember.
And that happened because I bought a bunch of vines from a really great nursery and planted the 50 acres that we planted at one time. Very expensive for me. And we didn't have quite enough fruit. So I bought wood from another nursery, and they sold me tainted wood that had vine mealybug in it.
Oh, dear.
And so when we planted it, very soon it spread all over my vineyard. We farmed it organically. The thing that we did that was most complicated was we picked the most devigorating rootstock that I could find. I had Professor Raymond Barnard, the man that developed all the Dijon clones at the University of Dijon in Burgundy. And he told me what I should plant, Riparian Gloire, one of the original American native cultivars, and very difficult fit with the clones that we use. You know, all the cultivars that are totally vinifera, and so there's a tenuous bond between the two, and the vines are always very, very, very lacking in vigor. So for 12 years, I had organically farmed, phenomenal fruit. I loved the way it developed. I didn't have to add any acidity. You know, we come from a place where in California, there's so much potassium in the soil, and there's so much poor farming when it comes to the choice of amendments to put into your soil, that everybody is just shoveling in the tartaric from Argentina as fast as they can make their muscles move. And we had no problem with that. We had low pH. I remember every year I'd be comparing things with my friend Dominique Lafont, and I'd show him finally that our pHs were getting lower in California in the near in the Santa Maria Valley, near where Bienacito is, than his were in Burgundy, as they were getting warmer weather and waiting until later to pick. And he laughed and he said, "Yes, Jim, I think your pHs are too low now, and your wines should be more generous." Can't win for losing. But all of a sudden I started noticing that I had a huge amount of virus in my vineyard. And it turns out that the sweet sucrosity that mealybug exudes is picked up by ants, and the ants march from one vine to the next, and they use their little pincers and they inject the virus into the plants while they're eating from the sweet material. And so I have a huge amount of dead vines in my vineyard, and we're bringing it back. We lapsed the organic certification, but we're still using intelligent fertilizers. I hope we're farming, you know, I don't say this as much as I used to anymore, because I'm not nearly the smarmy bastard I was when I was young, Dimitri, swear to God. And I used to, I'll always tell people, you know, that I'm farming it organically, not because I care about you. I don't care about you. You're my customer. It means nothing to me. I drink more of my wine than anyone ever could drink, no matter how much they love me. And so I care about me. And it's true. And so we're still using, I think, intelligent decision-making for the amendments we put on the vines, but it's no longer organic. And I still have organic parcels in various places because they haven't been attacked by red blotch virus. They haven't been attacked by leaf roll. They haven't been attacked by things that were ultimately mealybug that was killing my vineyard. But
Here's
it's
the question,
been, you know, let's just say that
where do you get your material from now? If you're replanting or you're
the
repairing a vineyard.
they're historically just nurseries that planted, but now everything I get in the last two plantings I've made has come from Papinerie Guillaume. They're a Burgundian papinerie seed nursery that developed a business. They tried to do it in California a long time ago, couldn't do it. Californians wouldn't let them. They went to Canada. And then when the Californians saw that the vines were coming down from Canada, they refused to let the vines come over, but they said, but now we'll let you license down here. And they've come down here, and I haven't planted all that much. In the last 5 or 6 years, I've probably planted a total of 10 acres, but all that material has been from Guillaume, and I trust them. Are we out of the reds?
We're
kind of getting to that time.
We should get a shifty on.
Takes a couple of reds.
So talking about red, whilst you're pouring yourself the Sanford and Benedict, you were great friends and still are with the mild boy, with Bob Lindquist. Why did you never think of Syrah? Why was it never on the radar for you?
I didn't need to be, because Bob and I moved into a building together to make wine 30 years ago. And so I had all the Syrah I needed, made by the best team in winemaking in California, and it just had Bob's label on it. And so we drank some incredible Syrah, and on a regular basis. He also did Roussanne. He did Marsanne, that was always really sexy. He did, his favorite wine that he made was kind of like a little Chateauneuf blend that he called Los Olivos Cuvée, and I drank that all the time. So I didn't have to do that. I ended up buying that ranch that's right next door to Los Alamos Vineyard, and they had an acre of Syrah Viognier. So I started making Syrah Viognier, and you know me, I don't tackle the low-hanging fruit. I went after Marcel Gigal, and I'll tell you, I haven't caught him. Maybe never will catch him. But 3 years in New Wood with 14% Viognier, and the wine's very, very special, very interesting. Some years it's really, really good. And
why does the home market not catch on to Syrah, or why hasn't it more than it has? Why is Syrah still a poor country cousin in California?
You tell me. I have no idea. You know, for years and years and years, long before Merlot ever became successful, I said after Cabernet Sauvignon, the next great wine is going to be Syrah. It's easy to pronounce, very important in America. It's dark and heady and delicious, and so Pinot Noir is never to get the attention because it doesn't have those characters. And all of a sudden Merlot comes out of nowhere, like Syrah, easy to pronounce, blah blah blah. But you know, I'm not in love with Merlot. I've never been in love with Merlot. When you go to Italy and they show you where they plant Merlot, it's always the worst sites, the worst grapes. They hate the stuff. They hate the stuff. And I love Syrah. I have a Syrah in barrel that I'm making for a weird combination of reasons with a friend of mine from Italy, and we're gonna bottle it at the end of 3 years in barrel, and the wine is going to be striking. And I'm going to see what people think, because the only Syrahs that are very popular in the U.S. right now are the ones that are made in Paso Robles that are 15 to 17% alcohol, and people love them to death. But not my style of wine. And yet they love them to death.
But when they're in a blend, they're more sniffy about them. That's the strange thing. Some wonderful blends from Paso Robles. Yeah. But tell us about this. Tell us about Sanford and Benedict, one of the oldest vineyards in your neighborhood, and your part in making it well known.
You know, and that part of it is a complicated thing. There's a lot of history at Sanford and Benedict, and Richard Sanford and Michael Benedict were really, really close and dear friends, and they had a kind of a rupture to their relationship over, you know, probably money more than anything, because the company wasn't as successful as they wanted it to be. And then when Richard left, he left like in 1980 and started making Sanford wines up in the Edna Valley. Michael needed to sell grapes to other people. And so I began to buy grapes there, and then I just stuck with it. I've begun a series of releases that are made because of my friendship with Pierre-Yves Collin in Burgundy. He has these incredible barrels made for him that are 350 liter. So they're about 40% again, as big as a normal barrel. And it's Francois Frere, the best cooper in the world, heavy toast, huge, and it makes the wine slightly reductive. It makes their structure exuberant. It just keeps the acidity firmly, instead of cutting it off with new oak at the end, it makes it extraordinarily good. And so I released the wine in 2015, called it the 30th celebration of buying fruit from Sanford and Benedict, because it's my 30th year that I'd worked with it in 15. And then I made the 16. I had this incredible idea about what to name it. So I called it the 31st anniversary celebration. Then I made it in 17, the 32nd. You see where I'm going with this? And it's a whole lot of fun. The wines are really, really special. Pinot Noir hasn't been as easy a deal for us because when Robert Adkin, famous London-based scientist, owned Sanford and Benedict, I got the best grapes off the property because I made wine for him. And I also got a chance to make a lot of wine for myself. And when Robert sold the vineyard to the Tolado family, they're nice enough to let me still buy grapes, which I appreciate very much, but they took away those best sections that I worked with, and I'm fine. You know, we've done well with sections.
And they kept them for themselves. They took
Well,
away.
they gave them to wherever they wanted to give them. Most of them went for themselves. I don't blame them.
Jim, we have a couple of questions that are very moot. Could you talk about, one, the aging of your Pinot Noirs? In my experience, they age like red Burgundy. And two, could you talk about the different terroir, your principal terroir of Santa Maria Valley, Biennasido, and also Sanford and Benedict, because they have different climates. The soils might be similar, but the climates are very different.
They are very different. Sanford and Benedict's quite a cool vineyard. And sometimes you see, like on this wine, great acidity, really nice elegance, good texture for the size of the wine, but a relatively small wine. And in the UK, that doesn't bother anyone. We've all gone through that in Burgundy, where you get a wine and you say, that's pretty light, and you put it in your mouth and you go, oh my God, what a mouthful. And that's what you get from Sanford and Benedict often. Biennasido, all the red wines have black pepper in them for some reason, and I love black pepper, and it's not too much, but it's always better colored, or often better colored, and a little bit more masculine style. We have other vineyards in different places in the area. Los Alamos, always very herbal, maybe physiologically less mature, but the wines are really good. Kick On, that we were talking about, which is the sole composition of Berry Brothers' own, and also the new wine that we're making. Super grapey and fruit-driven, very Californian Pinot Noir, but made with a Burgundian sensibility. And I think those wines are real special. We have a next door neighbor vineyard to Biennasido. Right next door is the Runway Vineyard, run by Abel Maldonado, who's Lieutenant Governor of California to Arnold Schwarzenegger. So he's got a lot of stories that keeps me laughing all night long, no question. And Abel's farming his grapes really well. We're doing really well with them. And then we have a few other places that we work with now and again that we're getting more involved with. But the two polar zones for us for Pinot Noir are Biennasido and Sanford and Benedict. Let's taste the Biennasido wine, and that's our last one. It's called Knox Alexander, named after my son, who's going to school in Japan right now. I just got back from a 2-month trip in Japan. I had 2 weeks of quarantine, living in a hotel room by myself. I couldn't see my children. I couldn't go out to a restaurant. I couldn't do anything that's wonderful in Japan. And I will tell you, I learned a lot with that 2-week quarantine. I learned that I'm a freaking boring person by myself.
I think anyone is when they're locked in. Tell us about the aging of your wines, which I think is important, because when you consider some of the fleshier, high pH Pinot Noirs of California fame from yesteryear, they don't age at all. But yours, I've drunk at 15, 17 years old, and they're still going strong. So what is it?
Well, the most important thing, of course, is to get all of your reactions complete. So the fermentation to be dry, the malolactic fermentation to be finished, and then to stabilize the wine with a long time in barrel. And I think the long time in barrel is the thing that I've learned most. Patience. I'm an impatient man by nature, and to leave a wine in barrel for 2 years, 2.5 years, as it's getting better, to recognize that, and then bottling it with minimum processing. We find, if we need to find, for tannin, and we don't filter. And it's really put us in a position. In the beginning, our Pinots didn't age very well because, I mean, I still have 82 Pinot Noir that I made that is no worse now than it was then, but there was no there then.
It wasn't up to much then.
It's a rock. It's a rock.
Jim, I have two further questions. One plays to your chefing ability. And when I stayed at your ranch, the thing that struck me the most was your amazing kitchen. So one question is, what would you eat with these Pinot Noir? And the second one is bottle weight. Now, I once remember you telling me when you were bottling up the Knox Alexander in that heavy bottle for the first time, I said, why would you use such a heavy bottle, heavier than a champagne bottle? And I think you were just making fun of me at the time. You said, because it pisses off those people who ask me that question.
Well, I might have said that. I've gone through a lot of phases on that. I'm currently at battle with Jancis again over it. And I want to apologize to her, because what I could have answered to the Japanese person that asked me 3 days ago that same question is I've changed the bottle 3 times. Yeah. And so we're now not as heavy as we used to be. But I asked my children if they liked the big bottles that we had to celebrate the wines I made for them, and they did. So I didn't take it away. Hildegard is now in a regular bottle. Yeah. And that was in the heavy bottle too. Yeah. Back when Jancis first talked to me about it. The Nuit Blanche Au Bouge Chardonnay was in a super heavy bottle. Now it's in just almost the same thing as a regular bottle. So we've backed off on it. But you know, I did it. I mean, it's interesting to me because I'm a poor guy. Both my grandfathers were coal miners, and so I get credit for being more environmentally correct than I might actually be. But I don't believe in much sulfur in my wine. I don't believe in lead in my capsules. I'm pretty careful with the chemicals I use for my health and for your health and for everybody else's health. But I got a little bit pissy when the heavy bottle thing came up. And so I started thinking about it. My answer, which was just systematic, and every time I use it now, I really make somebody angry. And there you are. But I said, you know, in the real world of things, the amount of damage that the heavy bottles that a small winery like a Bon Climat makes, shipping them around the world, is not nearly as bad as, say, Heineken beer in bottles. Billions of cases being shipped around. But I like Heineken beer.
You do produce very little Knox Alexander.
Very little.
Yeah.
Very little. But anyway, we're coming to grips with it only because I really thought that would be a question that wouldn't dog me. And it's turned out that it's something that people really believe in fervently. And I'm hoping that, I was going to name names, but I'm not going to name names, but there's a lot of famous North Coast California winemakers selling $125 bottles of wine that are in the same glass that I use. Not so much in Burgundy glass, but in claret glass, you know, the full 1 kilo empty bottles. And as long as you're putting pressure on them too, it's okay, because I think that's been one of the things that in America got us a little bit of attention in the beginning. Serious packaging. I used to have all my Isabel and my Knox were in wooden boxes.
I remember.
And I just couldn't justify the expense. I couldn't justify the rising prices and stuff. And so I stopped doing it. But big bottles, wooden boxes, and then people kind of take you a little bit seriously.
Jim, apart from being an excellent winemaker and a raconteur, you're also a very, very good cook. What do you eat with these wines, particularly the Pinot Noir?
Well, you know, one of the things that I would say with these Pinot Noirs that I used to say, and I'll still say, is that cooking any protein over a red oak fire, California white oak fire. You know, if you go to the Hitching Post restaurant in our neighborhood with Frank Ostini, his family pioneered that kind of cooking. And if you cook a ribeye steak heavily marbled with Pinot Noir, shocks me. I never had steak with Pinot Noir, but it shocks me how good it is. But duck, chicken, salmon, tuna, all those things as they're smoked are wonderful. I used to always say duck, and I used to always say duck with a sauce made from a berry, a really great house-made vinegar, and wine, and put that all together and put that on the duck and have that with the Pinot Noirs. They're extraordinary together. I would also say now, I've gone completely crazy for Asian food. And so we have more raw tuna or lightly seared tuna to go with it. And then those kinds of things with, this is going out on a limb now, because whenever I get there before other people, they really get upset. But at the risk of making someone totally into Japanese cuisine upset, I will tell you one of the things that I've discovered is, I love dashi. I love the bonita flakes and the combination that they have with kombu and different things to make these fish stocks that are there. And they're very smoky and very interesting. And I make mine really strong. And that with Pinot Noir is a wonderful thing together. Wonderful thing. Champagne, Chardonnay, sushi, glory. It's really wonderful. I love sake, and I drink sake when I'm in Japan, but I think I'd rather have champagne with sushi than almost anything on earth.
I think that sounds very, very sensible. In terms of your everyday cooking, I've had a couple of great meals in your winery. Do you cook every day for your team?
I do. And I'm not cooking today because this is my cooking hour to be here.
Yeah,
exactly. I made them a really good lunch yesterday. I get so far out there. I've been cooking things like Iranian beef stew that I found a recipe of, and it sounded really good. And nobody I know has been to Iran. They couldn't prove whether I was right or wrong when I was making it, but all kinds of funny, whacked out stuff like that. I made a Brazilian feijoada 2 weeks ago. I hadn't made that in a long time. I visited Brazil in '84, and I like to cook like that from my memory. But yesterday I got back to roast chicken, French style, with crumbled rosemary all over it, and roasted potatoes. I made the melting bistro leeks that you get occasionally in France, where you taste the leek and you go, that's the best food on earth, compared to all the times you eat leeks where you go, who cares? And then I also made a salad with a mustard vinaigrette, and I made Mario Batali Brussels sprouts, where you cut them in half, you sear them on one side, and then you pour in red wine. So the one side gets really, really dark in color, and then it steams in the wine, finish them off in the oven and serve them. And I ate that, and I said, I see this French thing now. I see why people still cook French and Italian. I don't need to only go to Japan and to Asia.
In terms of your operation and what you're doing now, other than what you like doing, cooking, exploring your sites, these new grapes you were talking about, Grenache Gris and Chenin and various others, what is really floating your boat at the moment?
I'm really crazy about Grenache, and I could date my craziness about Grenache to the 1988 harvest when I visited Jacques Reynaud from Reas, and had an incredible visit, incredible man. He went out to dinner with me and my friend Patrick Lessec, who's a wine importer and used to run a restaurant in Santa Barbara. Great guy. And it was just a wonderful time. And I tasted Grenache, long aged in barrel and made by a man who could have been a Pinot Noir esthete at any point in his life, because his Grenache tasted more like soulful, phenomenal, extraordinary Pinot Noir than anything else. So I thought, as a Pinot Noir maker, I might be able to do that. I planted it. We're making it. We'll see what happens. But I believe in Grenache. I planted Grenache Gris because I was at a tasting down in the south of France. The gentleman next to me had a winery called Matassa, and he made a slightly orange version, but still an incredible Grenache Gris.
Yeah.
And I ended up telling him I was going to make Grenache Gris, and he just called bullshit on that. And 8 years later, I planted Grenache Gris, and I'm really having fun with that. Really having fun with that. But Nebbiolo is my big passion now, and it's been my big passion. I made my first Nebbiolo in '86.
I remember tasting Nebbiolo in the late 90s from you.
Yeah, no, they're really rocking. They're really rocking. I have my own vineyard now, and the first wine that I made that was aged longer than 4 years in barrel was in 2000. Wine was very, very light in color, almost like that Sanford Benedict Pinot, but is aged brilliantly. And it's actually darkening now, which I find so funny, because the longer you age Pinot Noir, the lighter it becomes, no matter what happens. And the longer you age Nebbiolo, no matter how you age it, it gets darker.
Jim, I think we've answered all the questions that have been put in the chat and Q&A. Before we go, what now? I mean, you're a youngish guy. You're not a spring chicken anymore, but
not a spring chicken.
What now? What are you going to do now?
I'm going to continue to make a small amount of wine by myself that I'm going to really enjoy doing. And I remember going and tasting wine with Henri Jaillet the last 4 or 5 years of his life. And we'd go down and we'd taste his wine, which he wasn't making. Because, he said after 95, he was retired, wasn't making any wine, because that's the only way he could get his French government payroll, that they would give him all the money he paid in. And he still made wine to make himself happy. And I'll do that. But I've got a team now that is unbelievably extraordinary. Joe Madelman, who's worked with me for 30 years, Enrique Rodriguez Hernandez, who's been my cellar master since 1988, Arturo Alvarez, who's been working with me for 23 years. Their children are now working with us, and various folks. Isabel's with the company. I'm still optimistic Knox may come back to the company, but if those things all happen, then I'm just going to continue being the mind behind. So I'm going to continue observing everything.
So you have a succession plan.
I have a succession plan, but you can't plan anything these days.
There are all sorts of expressions of opinion in the chat about the wines, that Hildegard is the wine of the night, that the Sanford and Benedict is really showing better tonight than the Knox. I think the Sanford actually is showing extraordinarily well. Thank you.
And I love Hildegard. It's a real eye opener.
It's a revelation for me. How will these two Pinots be tasting in 20 years, do you think?
I think the Knox will just be shedding its slightly masculine tannin and its firmness, and will be really, really, really generous. I was in Japan and Hokkaido with a bunch of wine collectors, and so I took over 99 Knox. The second year Knox was alive, second wine that I made, and it was just mind-blowing. It was so good, and it had gotten darker and more complex, a lot more flower petals and earth and leaves and stuff, which I like to see out of Pinot Noir. I love fruit, but I want to see it as it ages. Our Sanford and Benedict wines never go anywhere negative. The lightest, the most ephemeral and ethereal become sturdier, and then they have great length to them. They're always the longest Pinot Noirs that I make, and they age really well.
Jim, I think it just leaves me to thank you. I mean, this is a 1 hour Zoom call, and that's not an awful lot of time. You're a man with many, many opinions, and you're generous with your time, as you are cooking for your crew, and having eaten at your place a couple of times and come away barely conscious and barely able to walk. I can vouch that your ability to make people happy is writ large in your wine. So a glass of wine with you, sir. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dimitri. And I want you to know, if we do this again 5 years from now, I'll probably have to get up to go to the bathroom twice. And so as I get older, I'm generous with my time, but I've got to
it's Anno Domini. It's Anno Domini. It happens to us all eventually. Thank you very much. Next time we'll do it will be a lot sooner than 5 years, I can guarantee it. It'll be on film.
Right.
Cheers to you. And thank you all for listening. What a wonderful evening with this very generous man who happens to be one of the world's best winemakers. Thank you, Jim.
Thank you.
And Isabel, too.